Part 4. As the Thénardier tavern was in that part of the village which is near the church, Cosette had to go to the spring in the woods, towards Chelles, to draw water. She looked no more at the displays in the booths. So long as she was in the lane Boulanger, and was in the vicinity of the church, illuminated stalls lighted the way. But soon, the last gleam from the last stall disappeared. The poor child found herself in darkness. She became buried in it. Only, as she became the prey of a certain sensation, she shook the handle of the bucket as much as she could on her way. That made a noise which kept her company. Cosette thus passed through the labyrinth of crooked and deserted streets, which terminates the village of Montfermeil towards Chelles. As long as she had houses, or even walls on the sides of the road, she went on boldly enough. From time to time, she saw the light of a candle through the cracks of a shutter. It was light and life to her. There were people there. That kept up her courage. However, as she advanced, her speed slackened as if mechanically. When she had passed the corner of the last house, Cosette stopped. To go beyond the last booth had been difficult. To go further than the last house became impossible. She put the bucket on the ground, buried her hands in her hair, and began to scratch her head slowly, a motion peculiar to terrified and hesitating children. It was Montfermeil no longer. It was the open country. Dark and deserted space was before her. She looked with despair into this darkness where nobody was, where there were beasts, where there were perhaps ghosts. She looked intensely, and heard the animals walking in the grass, and she distinctly saw the ghosts moving in the trees. Then she seized her bucket again. Fear gave her boldness. Said she, "I will tell her that there isn't any more water." And she resolutely went back to Montfermeil. She had scarcely gone 100 steps when she stopped again and began to scratch her head. Now it was the Thénardier that appeared to her, the hideous Thénardier, with her hyena mouth and wrath flashing from her eyes. The child cast a pitiful glance before her and behind her. What could she do? What would become of her? Where should she go? Before her the spectre of the Thénardier. Behind her all the phantoms of night and of the forest. It was at the Thénardier that she recoiled. She took the road to the spring again and began to run. She ran out of the village. She ran into the woods, seeing nothing, hearing nothing. She did not stop running until out of breath, and even then she staggered on. She went right on, desperate. Even while running, she wanted to cry. The nocturnal tremulousness of the forest wrapped her almost completely. She thought no more. She saw nothing more. The immensity of night confronted this little creature. On one side the infinite shadow, on the other an atom. The spring was a small natural basin, made by the water in the loamy soil, about 2 feet deep, surrounded with moss, and with that long-figured grass called Henry IV's colours, and paved with a few large stones. A brook escaped from it with a gentle, tranquil murmur. Cosette did not take time to breathe. It was very dark, but she was accustomed to come to this fountain. She felt with her left hand in the darkness for a young oak, which bent over the spring, and usually served her as a support, found a branch, swung herself from it, bent down and plunged the bucket in the water. She was, for a moment, so excited that her strength was tripled. She drew out the bucket almost full and set it on the grass. This done, she perceived that her strength was exhausted. She was anxious to start at once, but the effort of filling the bucket had been so great that it was impossible for her to take a step. She was compelled to sit down. She fell upon the grass and remained in a crouching posture. She closed her eyes. Then she opened them without knowing why, without the power of doing otherwise. At her side, the water shaken in the bucket made circles that resembled serpents of white fire. Above her head, the sky was covered with vast black clouds, which were like sheets of smoke. The tragic mask of night seemed to bend vaguely over this child. Jupiter was setting in the depths of the horizon. The child looked with a startled eye upon that great star which she did not know, and which made her afraid. The planet, in fact, was at that moment very near the horizon, and was crossing a dense bed of mist which gave it a horrid redness. The mist, gloomily empurpled, magnified the star. One would have called it a luminous wound. A cold wind blew from the plain. The woods were dark without any rustling of leaves, without any of those vague and fresh coruscations of summer. Great branches drew themselves up fearfully. Mean and shapeless bushes whistled in the glades. The tall grass wiggled underneath the north wind like eels. The brambles twisted about like long arms, seeking to seize their prey in their claws. Some dry weeds, driven by the wind, passed rapidly by, and appeared to flee with dismay before something that was following. The prospect was dismal. Darkness makes the brain giddy. Man needs light. Whoever plunges into the opposite of day feels his heart chilled. When the eye sees blackness, the mind sees trouble. In an eclipse, in night, in the sooty darkness, there is anxiety even to the strongest. Nobody walks alone at night in the forest without trembling. You feel something hideous, as if the soul were amalgamating with the shadow. This penetration of the darkness is inexpressibly dismal for a child. Forests are apocalypses, and the beating of the wings of a little soul makes an agonizing sound under their monstrous vault. Without being conscious of what she was experiencing, Cosette felt that she was seized by this black enormity of nature. It was not merely terror that held her, but something even more terrible than terror. She shuddered. Words failed to express the peculiar strangeness of that shudder, which chilled her through and through. Her eye had become wild. She felt that perhaps she would be compelled to return there at the same hour the next night. Then, by a sort of instinct to get out of this singular state, which she did not understand, but which terrified her, she began to count aloud. 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 10. And when she had finished, she began again. This restored her to a real perception of things about her. Her hands, which she had wet in drawing the water, felt cold. She arose. Her fear had returned, a natural and insurmountable fear. She had only one thought, to fly with all her might, across woods, across fields, to houses, to windows, to lighted candles. Her eyes fell upon the bucket that was before her. Such was the dread with which the Thénardier inspired her, she did not dare go without the bucket of water. She grasped the handle with both hands. She could hardly lift the bucket. She went a dozen steps in this manner, but the bucket was full, it was heavy. She was compelled to rest it on the ground. She breathed an instant, then grasped the handle again and walked on, this time a little longer, but she had to stop again. After resting a few seconds, she started on. She walked bending forward, her head down, like an old woman. The weight of the bucket strained and stiffened her thin arms. The iron handle was numbing and freezing her little wet hands. From time to time she had to stop, and every time she stopped, the cold water that splashed from the bucket fell upon her naked knees. This took place in the depth of a wood, at night, in the winter, far from all human sight. It was a child of 8 years. There was none but God at that moment who saw this sad thing, and undoubtedly her mother, alas. For there are things which open the eyes of the dead in the grave. She breathed with a kind of mournful rattle. Sobs choked her, but she did not dare to weep. So fearful was she of the Thénardiers, even at a distance. She always imagined that the Thénardier was near. However, she could not make much headway in this manner, and was getting along very slowly. She tried hard to shorten her resting spells, and to walk as far as possible between them. She remembered with anguish that it would take her more than an hour to return to Montfermeil thus, and that the Thénardiers would beat her. This anguish added to her dismay at being alone in the woods at night. She was worn out with fatigue, and was not yet out of the forest. Arriving near an old chestnut tree which she knew, she made a last halt, longer than the others, to get well rested. Then she gathered all her strength, took up the bucket again, and began to walk on courageously. Meanwhile, the poor little despairing thing could not help crying, "Oh, my God, my God!" At that moment, she felt all at once that the weight of the bucket was gone. A hand which seemed enormous to her had just caught the handle, and was carrying it easily. She raised her head. A large dark form, straight and erect, was walking beside her in the gloom. It was a man who had come up behind her, and whom she had not heard. This man, without saying a word, had grasped the handle of the bucket she was carrying. There are instincts for all the crises of life. The child was not afraid. Part 5. The man spoke to her. His voice was serious, and was almost a whisper. "My child, that is very heavy for you, which you are carrying there." Cosette raised her head and answered, "Yes, monsieur." "Give it to me," the man continued. "I will carry it for you." Cosette let go of the bucket. The man walked along with her. "It is very heavy indeed," said he to himself. Then he added, "Little girl, how old are you?" "8 years, monsieur." "And have you come far in this way?" "From the spring in the woods." "And are you going far?" "A good quarter of an hour from here." The man remained a moment without speaking. Then he said abruptly, "You have no mother, then?" "I don't know," answered the child. Before the man had time to say a word, she added, "I don't believe I have. All the rest have one. For my part, I have none." And after a silence, she added,
I believe I never had any.
The man stopped, put the bucket on the ground, stooped down, and placed his hands upon the child's shoulders, making an effort to look at her and see her face in the darkness. The thin and puny face of Cosette was vaguely outlined in the livid light of the sky. "What is your name?" said the man.
Cosette.
It seemed as if the man had had an electric shock. He looked at her again, then, letting go of her shoulders, took up the bucket and walked on. A moment after, he asked, "Little girl, where do you live?"
At Montfermeil, if you know it.
"Is it there that we are going?"
Yes, monsieur.
He made another pause, then he began. "Who is it that has sent you out into the woods, after water at this time of night?"
Madame Thénardier.
The man resumed, with a tone of voice which he tried to render indifferent, but in which there was nevertheless a singular tremor. "What does she do, your Madame Thénardier?"
She is my mistress,
said the child.
She keeps the tavern.
"The tavern," said the man. "Well, I'm going there to lodge tonight. Show me the way."
We are going there,
said the child. The man walked very fast. Cosette followed him without difficulty. She felt fatigue no more. From time to time she raised her eyes toward this man with a sort of tranquillity and inexpressible confidence. She had never been taught to turn toward Providence and to pray. However, she felt in her bosom something that resembled hope and joy, and which rose toward heaven. A few minutes passed. The man spoke. "Is there no servant at Madame Thénardier's?"
No, monsieur.
"Are you alone?"
Yes, monsieur.
There was another interval of silence. Cosette raised her voice.
That is, there are two little girls,
"What little girls?"
Panine and Zelma.
The child simplified in this way the romantic names dear to the mother. "What are Panine and Zelma?"
They are Madame Thénardier's young ladies, you might say her daughters.
"And what do they do?"
Oh,
said the child.
they are beautiful dolls, things which there's gold in. They're full of business. They play, they amuse themselves.
"All day long?"
Yes, monsieur.
"And you?"
Me, I work.
"All day long?" The child raised her large eyes, in which there was a tear, which could not be seen in the darkness, and answered softly.
Yes, monsieur.
She continued, after an interval of silence.
Sometimes, when I have finished my work, and they are willing, I amuse myself also.
"How do you amuse yourself?"
The best I can. They let me alone. But I have not many playthings. Panine and Zelma are not willing for me to play with their dolls. I have only a little lead sword, not longer than that.
The child showed her little finger. "And which does not cut?"
Yes, monsieur.
said the child.
It cuts lettuce and flies' heads.
They reached the village. Cosette guided the stranger through the streets. The man questioned her no more, and now maintained a mournful silence. When they had passed the church, the man, seeing all these booths in the street, asked Cosette, "Is it fair time here?"
No, monsieur, it is Christmas.
As they drew near the tavern, Cosette timidly touched his arm.
Monsieur,
"What, my child?"
here we are, close by the house.
"Well?"
Will you let me take the bucket now?
"What for?"
Because, if madame sees that anybody brought it for me, she will beat me.
The man gave her the bucket. A moment after, they were at the big door of the chop house.